Hello, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us. It's James Villeneuve here in Toronto. Just a quick question before we start. For those of you that don't know, the Ambassador's father was our Ambassador to the United Nations. And what's it like following in your father's footsteps in that role? Obviously, an incredible role for Canada.
Well, it's fantastic for me because it obviously makes me think a lot about my dad as well as my mom. It's at my age now, at 73, it's an ironic place for me to be. But it's also, I think, for me, at a personal level, it's very much a culmination of a life that in politics and public life that has led me to this place, and I feel very much that it's kind of like the logical place for me to be. But I hear my father's voice and think of his example a lot, and he was a person who had a big impact on my life as he did on many other people's lives. But he was a great fellow.
Very distinguished career for sure. And we have a newly re-elected government here in Canada, a new global affairs minister. Have the priorities changed for you since the election, or are they kind of business as usual?
Well, I wouldn't say business as usual, because business hasn't been usual. I mean, we're in the middle of several, major global crises, if you like. So I would say, I don't think the government's election has changed our agenda here very much. Obviously, things are dominated very much by COVID, by the ongoing impact of COVID. And COVID is a global event. It's a global pandemic, and it's also a global economic threat, which we're feeling, I think, quite strongly. Climate change, which is on everybody's mind because of COP26, but climate change will really come home to roost in New York and Geneva, two major multilateral centers where we're dealing with the impacts of climate change. The digital revolution, which is having enormous impacts, and the fact that it's not impacting some areas is a real problem because many people don't have access to. So we're really creating even greater, the digital divide is very significant. And the world of conflict, which is serious, severe, getting worse in many parts of the world, and this, of course, is the reason why we have the United Nations in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, too, the other question would be, in our history as call it a middle power, for lack of a better description, punching above our weight in the global forums. How do you see Canada's role right now under your leadership there in terms of our, brokering deals and moving things forward?
Well, I mean, we have to continue to recognize that both bilateral and multilateral diplomacy are important. And I think they really go together. It's not about, you choose one or you choose the other. I think in where I see it, we're really trying to work together much more effectively in Ottawa. I mean, all departments of government and the whole of government, but also dealing with the interests of the provinces, really trying to work together on being able to do more than one thing at a time, but advancing our own interests as a country, but also advancing the interests of a global community that I think whose security and whose prosperity makes a big difference to us as Canadians. Right. I think the other long-term development that's taken place that makes the UN a more central place for many Canadians is the world is in us as Canadians. We are part of this world. Our makeup has been transformative in the last 50 years. And that, I think, has made us more, as a country, more global in our outlook, more aware of conflicts, more aware of what's going on in many different parts of the world, and more engaged in them. Part of my job, frankly, is to be a bit of an advocate, not only for Canada here, but to be an advocate for the global community at home. because I have to keep reminding people that when they support our foreign assistance programs or when they support our engagement with the world, they're not doing something that's exterior to themselves or just for other people. We're doing something for ourselves because our interest lies really in seeing a world that is more secure, that is more prosperous, and frankly, that is more sustainable. And when those things fail, it affects our security, our sustainability, and it affects our prosperity. So these things go together. I think I have to keep repeating that message because one of the things that COVID has done is it's made us, I think, a little bit more inward looking than we need to be. And so maintaining our consistency of our presence, making sure that our walk and our talk are joined up, I think is exceptionally important. And it's part of my job to do that. At least that's the job that I think I have.
Good. You referenced climate change earlier, obviously a big issue with COP26 going on right now. What are you seeing with that happening right now? What are your thoughts on that as it progresses, that conference?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, we are a major energy producer. Although we're, when it comes to how much of the world's emissions are we responsible for, it's less than 2%. So you could say, well, Canada could do all this stuff and it wouldn't make a huge difference globally. But I think one of the reasons why I think the Prime Minister wants to lead on this is because he recognizes that it's if we don't show the example of what we can do, if we don't show an interest in technological change and in being more effective and more efficient and more sustainable in our own approaches, it makes it very difficult for us to really to lead. We can't lead unless we show leadership by example, and I think that's one of the most important things we have to do. That affects our credibility. It affects our ability to persuade others. I mean, I think it's important for Canadians to keep. We need to remind the rest of the world that more than 25% of the world's GHG emissions come from China right now. China is the largest emitter. And many times we focus all our attention on ourselves, or we focus all our attention on the United States. And we need, I think, to understand this is a global issue where the largest new sources of emissions are coming from newly industrializing countries. And their story is to say, well, yeah, but the cumulative impact of all that you've done has led us to this point where we have as much stuff in the air and the atmosphere as we have. And that's true. But the point is we can't keep adding to it at the pace that we are without causing a significant increase in global warming, which is the consequence that is leading to famine and drought and rising sea levels and more storms and much less sustainability in our overall environment. So we need to tell a story. We also need to persuade others to move. And finally, we have to help with the issue of adaptation. Certainly here in New York and in Geneva, where we meet all the countries of the world on a daily basis, the concern from a lot of developing countries, particularly small island states, small countries in Africa and so on, is they're not significant emitters at all, but they are significant recipients of the impacts of climate change. So you've got a country like Madagascar, which is experiencing serious drought at the moment and close to famine conditions, which is not a serious emitter. And they say, well, there's no justice in this. You have countries that are actually physically disappearing.
That's amazing.
And are scheduled to disappear over the next 10 to 15 years. Small countries, small populations, but still countries. And they feel a tremendous sense of climate injustice because they've sensed their extreme vulnerability, but quite rightly say we're not emitters. Like we're not causing this problem. We're not part of the problem, but we are part of the impact. So it's a complicated international question. It's a very, very critical issue for the world today. It will continue to have critical impacts, mainly because of its impact on issues like migration, agriculture, the sustainability, looking at the Amazon basin, looking at other places that are being transformed very, very quickly. And I think that's something that we can't underestimate, is the pace at which things are happening. And we have to bend this curve. We have to get this curve to change so that, in fact, change can happen in a completely different direction. And that's really what we're trying to do. And it's unprecedented. Never in human history have we faced this kind of a transformation where we willfully are deciding to take the steps that will transform how we produce goods and transform how we distribute them. And it's never been done before.
And what role does the developing world play in these conversations, specifically at the United Nations? What kind of conversations do you have with people in terms of how do we help the developing countries move forward?
Well, I think it's creating a lot of resentment from the developing countries that they don't see change happening quickly enough, and they do feel that they are on the receiving end of the problem without any great transformative change coming from other countries. And I think that's going to be the challenge in the next while, is to see how we can increase investment, how we can increase the pace of technological change, and how we can facilitate the transformation of the global economy in a way that's going to leave people better off, who are in the developing world and who right now are suffering as a result of COVID, as a result of the digital divide, as a result of climate change, and finally as a result of increased conflict. And I think this is something which we have to become more sensitive to as Canadians and as advanced economies. We have to understand that we are not seeing the kind of steady growth for everyone that's lifting everyone out of poverty. That's not what we're seeing, and that's a problem.
And you've referenced China as the world's largest emitter. They're participating in COP26, but not fully engaged on that, as I understand. What's the role? How do we interact with them in the forum that you're leading, but also directly as a government in Canada?
Well, it's a tough question. I mean, I think we have to appreciate the fact that China has ambitions in the UN system. It has global ambitions with respect to its desire for greater control of the region around it. There are serious issues of repression inside China, which should be of concern to everyone. And so I think we have to recognize that our relationship with China is not going to be an easy one, an automatic one. It's one where we have to engage in a way that is smart all around, and we're going to need to work with a number of other countries in the process of that engagement. I think that the possibility, we have to also recognize that China is a competitor. China is also a country that does not follow our norms of the rule of law, and that's something that I think is deeply troubling and has severe consequences for their own citizens. At the same time, as when we look at an issue like climate change, we're not going to be able to address it successfully unless China really joins in the global effort to reduce emissions and to make their economy more sustainable. I think the fact that President Xi was not at the meeting in Glasgow is not good. Because I think it's meant that we haven't spent enough time talking about how quickly can we get rapidly industrializing economies like China, like India, like many in the Middle East, like some countries in Africa. How can we get them to embrace more quickly the need for net zero as quickly as possible? I think, the Western countries and Western economies and most important, Western populations have embraced this and are embracing it for the most part. There's debates, of course, internally. There's differences of opinion, but I think there's a widespread acceptance of the science and also of the need for change. But the fact is, unless we get the rapidly industrializing countries to join in, these measures on our part will not work on their own. This relates to this fundamental question that we talked about at the beginning. We need global institutions to work because these are global problems. Climate change is not a Canadian problem alone, or a U.S. problem alone, or a European problem alone. It's a global problem, and we need to be much more tough-minded about identifying where are the sources of principal concern at the moment. Well, now we've identified coal as the most polluting carbon emitter. So we have to deal with coal. Canada's dealing with it. We're trying to get other countries to join with us. We need to put a price on carbon. And more it has to be a global platform, that price. And the Prime Minister is leading the way on that. And I think these are critical things that we need to do, which will necessarily involve China. So it's not about isolating China. It's about intensifying our engagement, but with our eyes wide open, with no naivete involved in terms of what we're dealing with.
You've got a new U.S. president, new administration, at least they're a year into it. Have you noticed a change in engagement, attitude at the UN? Yes,
there has been a change in attitude. I think, to be candid, in some areas the change is quite substantial. In other areas, it's not as much as people might think. And I think we as Canadians are very aware of this. The American public and American politics remains quite protectionist, and I think that's not to our advantage. I think we're in the middle of some very tough discussions with the Americans now about making the electric vehicle incentives broad enough that they include Canada, include other countries that are equally engaged in transforming the vehicle sector. If the Americans say, well, no, we're only going to do it for ourselves, that's a fundamental change to our trading relationship that we've established since the Auto Pact, going back to the 1960s. So I think that's we've got a real fight in our hands there, and I think it's something we have to understand that this is whether it was President Trump or President Biden. I think we're going to have to see in terms of what measures come forward whether we've been effective in getting them to understand the fact that they can't take a narrowly nationalist perspective on this question.
Wow. And finally, you did touch on the pandemic. What role is the United Nations playing in coordinating efforts? Obviously, the WHO is involved with this as well, but are there actual committees, people discussing how we help other countries? And
very much so. I mean, first of all, WHO is a UN agency. Yeah. It's not like on the moon. Mm-hmm. We work very closely with the World Health Organization through our UN office in Geneva. But the fact is that COVID is a political issue. It's an economic and social issue as well as a health issue. So inevitably, in New York, it's something which has been very much part of our debates, part of the initiatives that we take, part of our underlying efforts to try to get the vaccine and other treatments for COVID-19 more readily available around the world. We're not going to solve this issue and get into a post-pandemic phase until we resolve the issue globally. And I think we're seeing it now with a rise in rates in parts of Europe and elsewhere. This virus is not done with us yet. So we're going to have to develop a much clearer global approach to dealing with its impact. And that's something that I think is very much on my mind, and it's on the mind of our government as we try to encourage everyone to work much more closely on finding adequate supply and making sure we have adequate ways of getting it to people wherever they may live. That's got to be a global effort.
Wow, that's great. Well, Ambassador, I think we're pretty much out of time. I want to thank you. Hopefully life in New York is treating you well and it's getting back to normal there a little bit. Here,
a little more normal.
Okay.
A little more normal. Thanks, James. Appreciate it very much. Good to be with you and good to be with our audience tonight. Thank you so much for asking me to join you. Take good care.
Thanks for your service. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.